one thing that I think really comes through now, especially, but throughout our discussion and all the things I've seen of you, and it gets me back to this thing that came up at the beginning I'd really like to return to, is that you seem to have a very strong sense of context and self. I'll just say it. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not here to play one, but what you just described was that, okay, in one context, it made sense to be straight edge. You mentioned Minor Threat, great band, straight edge band, but when it came time to, you run around with your friends then, and it made sense to be, without alcohol or drugs or anything at that stage, and then you get into another context, it's like, okay, I can do this. I can drink and still perform well and do all the things I need to do. And then when that closes out, I'm gonna do something else. And some people are like that because they're kind of a chameleon, right? They're switching themselves depending on the context, and they're kind of getting accents when they're in one location or another. But that's not you at all. I can tell with certainty that's not you at all. That there seems to be a very strong sense of self, so that when we have a sense of self that's firm, we can go into different contexts. We can even change our behavior, but we don't lose who we are, which means we can always return to it. The image in my mind is like, I've done a little bit of scuba diving, not a lot, but during some of the more advanced training for us, right, this wasn't SEAL training, of course, was, following a line in the dark, like a night dive. And you're following a line, and, sometimes you're navigating with tools, but sometimes you're following a line underwater. And this idea that, like, you can let go of that line, but you remember where it is, and you can return to it. And that's kind of how I imagine the sense of self, because in different contexts, most healthy people modify themselves a little bit. We act differently at a wedding or a funeral than we do in class or out, with our friends. Of course, it's an important part of being a human, a functional human. So it seems to me that from a pretty early stage, you had a pretty good sense of self. Now, I don't know if you sit in your room and meditate on, like, who is Jocko Willink and, like, touch that central chord of self. I'm guessing you don't. But as I say this, I have to ask, was there something in your upbringing, your parents, or was it just kind of how you always imagined yourself as, like, yeah, this is who I am. Like, no matter what happens around me, like, I kind of know who I am. Even if I'm engaging in some of the behaviors that I might not do in another context, like, I know who I am. Because I actually think that many people do not have a very firm sense of self, or their sense of self is so rigid that they can only operate in this, like, narrow trench of one domain of life, and they end up very, very isolated. So I'd love for you to kind of share with us what your recollections are, kind of like the first time you realized, kind of like, yeah, like, I'm good in a bunch of different places. I'm safe, or I'm whatever. Because I think this also relates to confidence.
I'm glad you are giving me the benefit of the doubt on going in the teams and being like, oh, hey man, it looks like guys are drinking and I haven't really drank before, and it seems like these guys are having a good time. Let's go have a good time with these guys. And that's kind of what I did, right? As far as, and I look at it now, and unfortunately for me, I look at alcohol now as just, I've seen it destroy so many people that I've now kind of look at it and go, man, I don't think people should drink. And look, I get it. I'm kind of an example. Like, I used to drink and go out and have a good time, and it wasn't that big of a deal. It didn't negatively impact me in some dramatic way. But I have so many friends that it is horrible for. It is all but ruined their lives. And, it's totally legal, which is kind of bizarre. So I think that figuring that out, when I look back, and the culture in the SEAL teams was very alcohol-centric. And part of that is because, you got, like, it's just like a fraternity is alcohol-centric, or a football team is out, because you got a bunch of young dudes that are going to drink and have a good time. So it's just sort of a young dude kind of thing. And unfortunately, it ends up ruining a lot of people's lives, and they make bad decisions and they do stupid things, and it's just not good. And I think the culture is moving away from that a little bit in the SEAL teams. My alcohol brief used to say, I used to tell my guys, if you go out, you get a DUI, you get put in jail for a fight, you get hurt because you're doing something drunk, you just did Al-Qaeda's job for them. You just did Al-Qaeda's job. They want to take you off the battlefield, and you just took yourself off the battlefield. You can't go on deployment now. And that would always hit guys. And I think that's, the SEAL team's kind of leaning in that direction more, realizing the negativity of alcohol. I wish I would have realized that earlier. I wish I would have been a better leader and recognized that at an earlier stage, and recognize that just because I was kind of getting away with it, meaning it didn't really, I didn't wake up in the morning going, man, I can't wait to get drunk. I never really had that feeling. I wish I would have realized that there's other guys that do. And there's people that can operate and be functional and it doesn't really impact their lives, but there's a lot of people that don't. And I don't think it's worth the dice roll to start drinking. I just don't think it's worth the dice roll. What do you get out of it? So I think that overall, that's why if when I think about alcohol, I just think about all the lives that it's ruined, and I don't like it. And I wish I would have done a better job of saying, you know what, this is probably not good, and we shouldn't do this. And unfortunately, I didn't. And I try and convey that message as much as I can now. And it did bring me back to my roots, because when I was a kid, it was like alcohol is weak. And you look at these guys, they don't know what they're doing. They're acting like idiots. I'm not going to be like that. And so, as I got older, once I got on the SEAL teams, I kind of went back to that. As far as kind of where I became me, I just actually have to kind of give a lot of credit to the music that I grew up listening to and the attitude that we had back then. Listening to hardcore music, being able to stand up against what other people were saying, which is what you're doing when you're in that scene. And the whole DIY nature of it. Hey, we can just do this ourselves. We can just make this happen for ourselves. We don't need anybody else. We can do this. And that hardcore attitude and sticking by your friends and standing up and getting in fights and like, if that's what you're going to do, that's kind of my attitude. And I got interviewed for a documentary that they're making about Harley Flanagan and the Cro-Mags. And, when I was a kid, and actually through my whole life, like that music is the soundtrack to my life. And so I always would have that music running in my head. But to your question, I had something in me that when I heard that music for the first time, I was like, okay, here it is. Here it is. This is, I hear the Beatles, I hear the Grateful Dead, I hear the Rolling Stones, I hear the whoever. And you go, okay, that's fine. But when I heard hardcore music for the first time, when I heard the Cro-Mags, when I heard Agnostic Front, when I heard the Bad Brains, I thought it was just like, it was part of me already. And then it was the attitude. And again, you can listen to my podcast with Harley Flanagan. The way I viewed Harley Flanagan, the way I viewed the Cro-Mags was not the way they actually were. I mean, Harley was doing drugs. I mean, horrible drugs. He was on heroin, everything else. But his image was like straight edge, kind of spiritual. They had all that stuff going on. And I thought, okay, well, that's who they are. I didn't know. I'm like a kid living in the woods in Connecticut. I'm just kind of hearing what I'm hearing. Listen to the lyrics of Minor Threat, listen to the lyrics, and you go, okay, this stuff, I agree with this stuff. And I just think that kind of set kind of set a datum in my head of being okay with being outside, being okay with saying no, being okay with being a rebel, being okay with not going along with what everyone else is doing. And that became very important when I was in the military, and I looked at what leadership might be telling me to do and might think to myself, hey, that doesn't seem like a good idea. And having the wherewithal to say, hey, boss, I'm not sure this is a good idea. Not to be a jerk about it, but just to say, there might be a better way to get this done. What do you think of this? Or, hey, boss, can I ask you a question about that? So I think if I had to trace it back, having Black Flag My War Side 2 on my record player for like a year and a half straight, that's going to leave a mark, man. And I think it left a mark on me.
I love what you just said. And when I say love, I really mean it, because as we both know, we share a common love for certain music, in particular Minor Threat and some stuff from the punk rock scene. In particular for me, the Northeast punk rock scene, the Bruisers, Al Barr from the Bruisers. Now people know him as the lead singer for the Dropkick Murphys, but before that was the Bruisers. And we run the risk of going deep down a rabbit hole of music that most people may or may not be familiar with, although most people have heard of the Dropkicks. But Yeah, I'm right there with you. I mean, I remember the first time hearing Stiff Little Fingers or Rancid and even Bouncing Souls, right, from New Jersey. Not even Bouncing Souls. Sorry, Brian and Greg. Like, no, the Bouncing Souls, and going, yes, that's me. That's it. Like, but as you said, it was already kind of in you. It's like a recognition. And I bring this up and I want to highlight it, not because we share this, although I do find that to be an amazing kinship that we felt right away. And it was like, we probably riffed for 25 hours just on that. But it brings me back to this idea that certainly is not my idea. Actually, the first time I heard about it was from Robert Greene, who wrote the book Mastery, and some important writings, what was it? I think it was I forget how many laws of power, but those books.
Yep.
Robert Greene. Mastery is actually a book that I highly recommend people read because it talks about mentorship and finding mentors and the fact that we're supposed to break up and move on from mentors, and that mentors aren't always people that we know or that know us, et cetera. Amazing book, really. But he was the first person I ever heard describe this idea that if we think back long enough, there's some seed moment. Maybe it was shopping for the pants. It sounds like it was, but also music where you see something and it's like, yes, that's me and I'm that. And then that becomes a sort of soundtrack or visual image or something for your life that you carry forward with you. The neuroscientist in me wants to say that that is the first time that we really tap into this dopamine system in a way that is unique to us. Because every child responds to food with a little bit of dopamine when we're hungry, responds to warmth when we're cold, responds to a warm, dry diaper after we just wet ourselves, which we all did. I don't know, maybe Jocko, you changed your own diapers. But I'm guessing that someone changed your diaper at one point, not an image path we need to go down. But the idea is that we all have these universal sources of kind of having our needs met, going from discomfort to comfort and back again, which is basically childhood. But at some point, something comes along that we really feel like is unique to us. And it may be the thing that everyone else likes. Maybe it's top 40 or whatever it is. Maybe it's the shoe that everyone's wearing and that seems good. But I do think that there are certain people who are kind of 10 or 20 or maybe even 180 degrees off from what everyone else likes. And they're like, that thing is what's really cool. And it's a felt thing. And so along the lines of felt things as opposed to things that everyone values.